Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you guys for joining. I hope you guys are doing well. Welcome to the Creating and Inviting Pollinator Habitat Workshop with Allegheny Mountain Institute, partnered with Augusta Health. We are an educational nonprofit working to cultivate healthy communities through food and education. We strive to meet our mission through a three-pronged approach, which includes a 18-month tuition-free farm and food system fellowship, institutional support for schools and hospitals, and regional networking to build a food system that nourishes our bodies, our environment, and our economy. I'm Sarah Spinner. I'm a community fellow at AMI. I'll be hosting today's workshop, and I want to remind you that this is being recorded, so if you don't want to be in that recording, you can feel free to turn your video off. And also, everyone is currently on mute. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box at any time. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the workshop. We'll have time during the workshop to ask relevant questions and time at the end dedicated just to questions. And now I'm going to pass things over to Ren, my fellow community fellow. She's managing the gardens at Bessie Weller Elementary School, and she's going to be showing us some examples of her garden as well throughout the workshop. So here's Ren, and I'll start sharing my screen in just a second.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Yeah, thanks for coming. So today we're going to talk about how to create a pollinator habitat. So yeah, if you want to drop in the chat where you're from, that's definitely welcomed. Love to interface with you all. And yeah, so before we get started, I just kind of want to talk about the goals for the workshop. We're going to start off kind of talking about all the different reasons that pollinator populations are declining. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on that, and then we're going to move into an activity where we'll actually design a pollinator garden together and kind of reflect on different ways that we can take action that are going to benefit our pollinator populations that can go beyond also just the garden activity. So the overarching theme that I kind of want to bring in is that what impacts pollinators also impacts us. So this is not just a presentation about pollinator health, but it's also about human health. It's about having healthy ecosystems as a whole. It's important to keep that holistic perspective in mind because it's about having clean water, clean air, and healthy ecosystems overall. So to get started, we can just touch on what are pollinators and what does that include. They're a keystone species, as are humans, and they play a unique and crucial role in crop production. There are multiple different types of pollination. It's really just a bee moving, or a pollinator organism moving pollen from one flower to another. And some flowers or plants are self-pollinating, or they pollinate by the wind. So not all plants require pollination via an organism in order to reproduce. When that pollen is transferred, the fertilization occurs, and then the fruit or the seed comes as a result of that. However, even those plants that don't require pollination through an organism, they still benefit from having pollinators around. It can produce or increase the quality and the quantity of those organisms that are pollinated. So I think here we have just a diagram that shows that process of pollination. Just kind of a simplified graphic here that makes it nice and easy to see there. And this is kind of what I was talking about self-pollination and pollination carried by the wind. Some examples of self-pollinating plants, just going back to that other slide really quickly, is tomatoes, peppers, eggplants. Some wind-pollinated examples are strawberries, corn, wheat, oats, and then those that require insects for sure are kind of more of those like cucumbers, berries, raspberries, apples, pears, plums, more fruits and whatnot. So we'll talk a little bit about why it's important to prioritize pollinators. Plants that depend on pollination, they make up at least 35% of global crop production. And if you want to put it into economic terms, the total annual value of US honeybee products and services, that comes out to about 700 million. Of the 1,400 crop plants grown around the world, which includes our food and plant-based industrial products. Almost 80% of those require pollination by animals. So the impact of their presence is massive. And this also extends, kind of like I was mentioning earlier, to the ecosystem services that they provide. So that involves preventing erosion, carbon sequestration, things like that. And pollinators are required for the propagation of those species like wildflowers, and not just the crops that we depend on for our food. And so a lot of the primary reasons for pollinator population decline, a lot of them are human driven, unfortunately, related to agriculture. So monocropping and pesticides, using huge swaths of land, and that requires habitat destruction for the pollinators. In the United States alone, pollination of agricultural crops is valued at $10 billion annually, and that's so just in the United States. And globally, pollination services are likely worth more than $3 trillion. More than half of the world's diet of fats and oils come from animal pollinated plants. And the USDA estimates that crops dependent on pollination are worth more than 10 billion per year. There was a study done that talked about how pollination by honeybees and wild bees significantly increased yield, quantity, and quality, on average up to 62%, while the exclusion of pollinators caused an average yield gap of about 37% in cotton and 59% in sesame. So that's just kind of an example that illustrates how the loss of pollinators can lead to the loss of various crops. So yeah, here's an example of exposure pathways of pesticides. So we'll get into that in a minute. There's also, I wanted to touch on, let's see, habitat loss that occurs as a use of land use changes. So also with urban development and the increasing human population. And there are ways, I don't want to kind of create the idea or perpetuate the idea that humans are bad and harmful and everything that we're doing is awful and humans should just, because I think humans really have the potential. We are a keystone species. We have the potential to do a lot of good, and we can integrate pollinator habitat into cities and build community around it, and make it a really joyful, beautiful thing. So yeah, don't want to get too down on all these reasons for pollinator decline, but it is a major issue due to a variety of things. So another one of those things is pesticide use. Insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, they're used in urban spaces to maintain lawns. And lawns, this is just a little note on lawns, they're actually one of the most irrigated crops, but they don't really do anything. They don't provide habitat. The application of herbicides and pesticides is contaminating the soil and the water. And so we really have a lot of potential with all these lawns to help support pollinator populations. And this just shows the different exposure pathways. So we have direct exposure, residue contact, contaminated nesting material, and contaminated nesting areas. And it also often can persist in the environment for long periods of time for multiple generations of pollinators. So this isn't just a one generation deal. They persist depending on what their chemical makeup is. But there was a study done that a bunch of pollen samples from beehives were taken and stream samples, as you can see here, and more than 90% of those samples showed contamination with more than one pesticide. And those also have human impacts or human health implications. And also, even if it doesn't directly kill the pollinator, it can impact their ability to forage for food and for nectar. And just to navigate, it interferes with that process, and it can also kill important forage plants. So on the next slide here, yeah, so this is just shows, this is just a way to kind of conceptualize the impact of how much materials we need as humans in our modern life. Well, yeah, need, you know, I don't know. But anyway, yeah, so here we have this just a bunch of facts and figures that kind of show how reliant we are on materials that come from mining. And often mining is very destructive. It leads to habitat loss. A lot of times for things like uranium, for example, I mean, that also has human impacts. It's a bit of a tangent, but also, I mean, it's really difficult too, because lithium mining, for example, that is necessary for electric cars, that's extremely destructive and actually requires more fossil fuels to keep that going. So the answer is not necessarily more green capitalism and moving forward in that way, and just replacing our current modern lifestyles, but it's at least got to start with some community building around some environmental awareness that we can cultivate together and building community support networks and things of that nature, which we'll get into with the pollinator garden building activity as well. So here's just another graphic that shows a lot of the different materials that we're reliant on in big and small ways, you know, the computer, the road that you drive on, the car that you're driving in, things like that. So mining activities occupy 57,277 square kilometers around the world, which is difficult to kind of conceptualize, but it's a lot. More than 50% of land areas are concentrated in only 5 countries. Let's see. Yeah, so kind of the big idea here is what impacts pollinators also impacts us, and even if it's kind of a gradual thing that we're not immediately noticing, it has those larger scale implications on especially geological timescales. I think our human lives are only so long, and so sometimes we can have that amnesia with how quickly different species are going extinct. And the human population is predicted to grow by 25% in the next 50 years. So this, coupled with our land consumption patterns, means that there will be significant decreases in habitat available. A couple more statistics here. There's 3/4 of the land-based environment and about 66% of the marine environment. So 1/3 of the land, 66% of the marine environment have been significantly altered by human actions, and these trends are less prominent in areas that are held or managed by Indigenous people and local communities. So there really is a lot of strength in that. And more than 1/3 of the world's land surface and nearly 75% of freshwater resources are now devoted to crop or livestock production. So that's huge, more than 1/3 of the world's land surface and 75% of freshwater resources. Yeah, this just shows, this kind of quantifies the pollinator population decline. There's other factors too, like invasive plants. Oftentimes pollinators can't feed on invasive plants and they'll outcompete the native plants. So it's really good in our gardens to pay attention to native plantings, and there's also benefits to that, as we'll get into, but you know, they're better adapted. They've co-evolved with the ecosystem here for so long. So you know, it's the best supports the native pollinators. So it's a really good thing to pay attention to. And also some non-native species of pollinators can compete with native pollinators. So there's kind of an energetic exchange that occurs between the pollinator and the pollinator plant. And those with the native plants that have the greatest benefit to both the pollinator and the plant, because they have that co-evolved relationship over such a long period of time. Also, have to mention climate change that changes the ranges at which the flowering plants can occur. So when the ranges shift, they might become out of sync with their pollinators. There's all these different elements that are working together. And so the types and distributions of pollinators might change. And those adapted to warmer temperatures might extend their range, displacing other pollinators. And it just kind of creates that ripple effect of destabilization. And, there are things that it's a process of adapting, because, this is something that is our reality now. So I think the best thing that we can do is just kind of learn about native plants and learn about what we can do on a community scale to mitigate the most harmful impacts to the best of our ability. Yeah. Yes, here are just kind of some of the also human conflicts contribute to this as well. And that goes back to the uranium mining, for example. But yeah, human conflicts, parasites and diseases. There's many, many, many things, unfortunately, that are threatening our pollinator populations. More than 40% of our invertebrate pollinator species, which includes bees, moths, butterflies, they're threatened with extinction. So here are some of those major consequences: is food system instability, economic instability, environmental degradation, and decline or loss of plant species. And something I want to touch on is a lot of times people like to think, I guess since we're enmeshed in this capitalist world, or country at least, we often think in economic terms, but as there's the old saying of like, you can't eat money, or whatever the saying is. Anything that we do to benefit our environment is going to ultimately benefit our economy in the long run, because if we kind of just run ourselves into the ground, it's not good for anybody. Pollinators included. So yeah, now we can go ahead, now that we've kind of gotten a nice basis for why we're here, why we're doing this, as I'm sure all of you already have a good understanding of that since you're here in the first place. But we can go to the next slide. I just want to take a minute to pause and check in with you all. Maybe if you learned anything new, if anything surprised you, or if we could kind of sit together and think about what would a world look like if we were actively working to adapt or to remedy some of this damage. And then we can get into the activity where we kind of explore different ways to do this together. So if you want to drop it in the chat, I'd love to hear from you all. You can just take a moment to think about that too. I know it's kind of a big question. I think personally too, I'll just go ahead and mention while people are thinking, is that I think the lawns thing that I mentioned earlier, I feel like there's so much potential in lawns, and I've seen an increase in landscapers who are paying attention to native plantings and those that support pollinator populations. It's also extremely beautiful because a lot of the pollinator species are attracted to a variety of colors of flowers, shapes of flowers, and also heights. So it's good to get those height differences to create shelter and different food sources. Yeah, here we have turn lawns. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, turn lawns and grass areas into edible spaces for humans and pollinators. Yeah, and I think a note on that too is it's a great way to build community. You have people come in and they're like, oh, this is so beautiful. Tell me about this, and it's a way to spread education, awareness, and then also, meet new people, and you can share the food, and it's just this kind of great, wonderful, positive feedback loop. Let's see. I was surprised by how large the impact is of our daily resource use on pollinators. Yeah, that's really difficult because we're dependent on these systems that that exist and that we were born into. So sometimes it can be that the reason why I asked this question is because sometimes it can be really difficult to even imagine what a different world, different system might look like. It's very, very complex. So yeah, definitely not an easy question to answer. Plant native plants and wildflowers. Yeah, for sure. Definitely. Yeah, and we probably should keep going with this. But yeah, if anyone has any more thoughts as we go along, definitely very welcome to drop it in the chat. So let's see. One moment. Yeah. And so, yeah, something else that I wanted to mention is land access is a huge problem with this. So if you don't have access to land, there are ways that one could think creatively about it. So there's also community gardens in the area and different organizations where people come together to do this kind of work. I have some examples locally if you're local, but also you can do various Google searches and that might point you in the right direction. And so also I think it's really good to play to your strengths. So it's good to think that old saying of like think globally, act locally, examining those larger scale impacts of the things that you use on a regular basis, but also figuring out how you specifically can optimize your impact with your greatest strengths. So is that, are you an artist? Are you an educator? Or are you just a really good community member? Maybe you're really outgoing and just love talking to people. Building community, that's a really powerful thing that you could do as well. So what are your strengths? Political action is huge. I wanted to go ahead and drop a link in the chat, which takes us to a couple of petitions that you could sign. So I thought we could all just sign a petition together. I thought that might be fun. Let's see. I'll go ahead and put this link in the chat. And so if we pull up that link, yeah, there's one where it says, tell Kroger to stop selling food grown with toxic pesticides, tell Lowe's and Home Depot stop selling bee-killing Roundup. It's a really harmful pesticide, also for human health. And you can learn more about policy change, about your local grocery store, as you can see. So yeah, if you want to take a minute and sign one of those petitions and maybe drop in the chat which petition you signed. It'd be fun. Let's see. And yeah, just as we're doing that, I'll mention there's a lot of spraying that happens just in yards. That happens I've seen it happen at schools and with all the lawn activity. So if there's anything that you can do to go chemical free, then that's a really good action that one could take. All right, I'll go ahead and move on. Hopefully you've gotten a chance to sign that petition, and I definitely would appreciate if you could drop in with what petition that you signed, or if you gained anything from it that you thought was interesting. So yeah, moving into this next slide here, I put together a little video talking about the first steps for building that pollinator garden, which is, so step one is to find find your region. Oh yeah, Judy, thank you for the Kroger one. Yes, thank you. Getting to know your local pollinators, that's the first step, because something, a lot of times people have a lot of excitement and enthusiasm about this, which is great. But sometimes, yeah, Barbara, thanks for signing both. But mismanagement of land could be an issue too. There are some landscaping companies that will just kind of plant things for the aesthetic value and not pay attention as much to the way it impacts the insect populations. So this just points you to a resource where you can find your region, find out what pollinators are in your area, and also pretty much everything that you need as far as a list of plants, what kind of environment they like. And so I'll go ahead and drop that link here, and then we'll play the video.
The pollinators in this particular region are made up of bees, butterflies, birds, flies, moths, beetles, and bats. And there are many different species within those broader categories. So it's good to pay attention to the needs of those. This resource just shows a bunch of different plants that are available, and the resource can be specified for your region, but it's best to incorporate flowering plants and trees that are nutrient-rich, that have nutrient-rich nectar and pollen. It's also good to incorporate a diversity of plants and to plant strategically so that the plants are blooming for the longest amount of time possible. It provides pollen and nectar from early spring to late fall. It's also nice to include a variety of colors to attract a variety of pollinators, and it's also beneficial for you because it just is beautiful. It helps to incorporate different canopy layers in the landscape by planting trees, shrubs, and different sized perennial plants. The leaves can act as nesting sites for bees, and other dead plants, leaf litter, piled up wood, and things like that can also act as nesting sites and shelter from dangerous conditions. You can also leave some areas of soil uncovered, and that allows ground nesting insects to access those underground tunnels. And if you plant different plants in groups, then pollinators can move safely through the landscape in order to be protected from predators and weather conditions. Butterflies also need particular plants to act as host plants throughout their larval development. So that's another thing to consider when designing your pollinator garden.
That takes us to, this shows us our agricultural zones, which can be a helpful tool in deciding which plants. But this original resource from pollinator.org, that provides a lot of what you need to know, especially in terms of making sure that flowers are blooming for the longest amount of time possible throughout the year. So spacing your plantings with that in mind. So this next slide here, this is just for our region here. So I don't know if where everyone is from, but this is just here in Virginia, or in our section of Virginia, as Central Appalachian Broadleaf Forest, coniferous forest. And we have bees, butterflies, beetles, birds, moths, and flies. And so the primary vegetation is determined by that elevation zone. So yeah, just a good thing to be aware of when you're taking that first step. So the three main things that pollinators need are food, shelter, and water. And this is just some information that helps with site selection when you're planting a pollinator garden. So full or partial sun, 6 to 8 hours a day, close proximity to water source. We'll get into, if you aren't naturally near a water source, there's not a lot of people I imagine are. You can make little water sources. I'll have a slide on that in a minute. But also as protected as possible from traffic, runoff, chemicals, predators, the elements. Yeah, so as it says here, a great site to plant a pollinator garden could be right up against your house near a large tree, or in just a chemical-free zone. That's a really key thing too. Yeah, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but just wanted to harp on the native plant thing and just kind of talk about why it matters. They co-evolve with the native pollinators and also, the fungi there, the mammals, the organisms, the soil, co-evolved over a long period of time. And there's also, it doesn't have to be 100% native plants necessarily. There are naturalized plants, and there's a continual process of evolution that is occurring. So it's not so black and white, but I think it's really important to pay attention to. There are certain, like for example, there's an invasive tree here called the tree of heaven that some of you might know about it. You can see it, popping up everywhere, and it really just outcompetes a lot of these species. And the native pollinators here can't feed on it. So it is a threat to their populations, and therefore also the continuation of various species here. Yeah, they also don't require as many other inputs like fertilizers or pesticides that might contaminate the soil, but also those things cost money. So, it's one less thing or a couple less things to spend money on, and they can sequester the carbon from the air and offer habitat. It's just better adapted overall. So they're going to do well too, which is a huge benefit. Yeah, so this is going back to the water source. These are just, it's very simple. You can do a shallow tray with some rocks in there, and that provides a good water source. You just want to make sure you keep it clean. Make sure it's not in direct sunlight all the time so it doesn't overheat when it gets really hot. And you want to keep the algae levels really low, because you don't want contaminated water for your pollinators. And yeah, this is a fun thing. It's bee boxes, and this can provide habitat for those solitary bees. And people have experienced increased, like if you put it in your garden, for example, just increased quality of produce and also quantity. And this also applies to the pollinator plants that you plant, or yeah, just whatever planting you have going on. So I made a short little video here.
So we're here in the Bessie Weller School Garden next to the Pollinator Meadow, where we have a variety of flowers, plants that will help support pollinator populations in our area. And I just wanted to show you an example of a bee box. We actually just purchased this. This one is for mason bees, which are the solitary bees that come out in the spring, and that's when they will start to lay their eggs, and they can do that in these long, narrow tubes here. So in the spring, around April or May, the mason bees will begin laying their eggs and adding nectar and pollen along the length of each of the paper tubes. They'll seal the egg as they go, and when the tube ends, they'll cover it with a thin layer of mud. And the following spring, they'll chew through the mud, and then they'll emerge. And they can help pollinate whatever you have growing in your garden or your farm or whatever planting you have going on.
All right. So there was a comment that said, do you have a link to this bee box or a recommended place to purchase? And the answer is yes, I do have a link. I'll go ahead and drop that. But so the one that I was talking about in this video is particularly for mason bees, and the bamboo tubes are kind of to a certain size. And these are the bees that come out in the spring, but there are also leafcutter bees, for example, that come out in the summer, and they are a bit bigger. So when you're buying a bee box, it's something to keep in mind. I chose this one from Lowe's because it is inexpensive, but there are lots of different types of bee boxes. There are some that are more aesthetically pleasing, just, and you can also even build it on your own if you're handy with construction. But yeah, this is just a nice inexpensive option. Okay. So on this next slide here, we just want to go back to that holistic mindset. We want to make sure we provide shelter from intense weather and predators, and this allows pollinators to have nesting sites and overwintering sites. So some ways that you can provide shelter include you can have dead wood around, rock piles. You can hold off on your garden cleanup until spring, so the different the dead foliage will offer some of that shelter. If you need to use mulch, I would consider using compost or shredded leaves instead of chipped wood products, because they still offer weed suppression and water retention, but they're going to be light enough to allow ground nesting bees to pass through. And it's also good to leave some bare patches of ground that allow the ground nesting bees to nest. And they also, these alternatives also release nutrients and provide organic matter, so that improves your soil quality and is overall positive, net positive. You want to include host plants for larval development and nectar plants. And different pollinators prefer different types of soil, plants, and even colors of plants. So it's good to reference the guide and kind of decide, what pollinators do I want to see? Is it hummingbirds or bees or butterflies? And is it all of them? And you can kind of go from there too. In this graphic shows, kind of these different features that support these things that I've mentioned here. Yeah. So yeah, I thought it would be fun if we did this pollinator garden design activity together to kind of get the ball rolling. So with that resource that I sent out earlier, you can type in your zip code and it will pull up that guide. And I can do it along with you for this region that we're in, but if you're in a different region, or if you want to design it for yourself, then I invite you to do it along with me. So we want to identify at least 3 pollinators in our area and then select about 3 plants that support those pollinators. Kind of as I mentioned, it's good to consider the height, color, and shape diversity. It doesn't have to, it's not high stakes here on this webinar, so, but those are just good things to consider. And also to determine one additional way to create habitat. So whether that's a bee box or something else creative, like a pile of something to create shelter, or whatever it is. And there's also other resources. So after the webinar is over, there are places that you could turn, such as Facebook pages, to share your ideas and your plants. And this is great because it has that community building element. If you're in this area, there's Harrisonburg Plant Exchange Facebook page, and people will just post about different plants that they have in excess of, and you can come and pick it up for free. And sometimes people are looking for trades, so whatever the situation is. I've gotten a couple of plants that way, like mountain mint. I got one time. Let's see. And I'm sure there's other Facebook pages around that I'm not aware of. I know there's some mutual aid networks that are maybe less plant focused, but a potential avenue. And also, if you're part of an organization, oftentimes they can get donations. Working for Bessie Weller, I've been able to get a lot of donations because people are just kind of really excited about those community projects. So maybe you're a part of a community garden. They often can get donations, so that can be a great way. I got a native plant donation from, it was Farfield's Nursery. So that's one that's in this area. There's also the Natural Garden, I think in Harrisonburg. So we can go ahead and do this activity together. So we'll go ahead and identify some pollinators. Be entering my zip code. I wish I could be sharing my screen here, but I'll just kind of narrate and do it along with me. Okay, so for example, there are butterflies that like bright flowers, including red and purple. So just off the top of my head, I can think of echinacea, coneflower. That's a really good one. There's also milkweed, bee balm. Those would really benefit butterflies. I know redbud can be a good pollinator species, so that'll be a bit taller, so you can get that variety. There's also showy goldenrod. Salvia. Okay, nice. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Barbara. That's Monarda. Cool. Yeah. So these are really good starting points for our garden designs here. And really this resource is it's just so good. You know, it provides everything that you need. So really great resource to go back to. I'm thinking maybe about, Joe Pyeweed. That's a really good one. Zinnias. So thinking about also an additional element that you could add. You could do kind of as I mentioned, is the water fixture, the bee box, the pile of wood, leaving some soil uncovered, group plantings, things like that. I don't know if anyone has any kind of creative ideas, if anyone's kind of minded that way. It'd be interesting to hear. So yeah, I would invite you to continue with that activity. Just in the and we can continue doing that too. I think as you're moving through that, I just want to mention some other things that you could even do. On the next slide, I just listed a couple. Again, these are local, but if you're not local, it's pretty easy to find. Well, it is generally easy to find various groups that do similar things. So we have the Virginia Native Plant Society. They do a lot of work on trails and big projects, things like that. Virginia Master Naturalist and Silver Run Forest Farm. Silver Run Forest Farm does some really good water remediation activities. Let's see. I made a large plate with higher edge and put it up about a yard high. Have stones and branches so they can rest and drink. Yeah, no, that sounds great. That's a really good way to support pollinators. And yeah, Silver Run Forest Farm is also connected with Vine and Fig, which is a really good community organization. And that goes back to the holistic aspect of things. Is anything that you do to benefit the environment and to kind of build that alternative future, so to speak, that keeps these things in mind in addition to the development, like that's going to come back around and benefit your pollinators. So yeah, and here's a link to the Natural Garden, which is a local native plant nursery, and I put a little link there that I think we'll send out. Those are just some additional tips for planting your garden. So Judy says, I have bird feeders and bath wood pile coneflowers. Nice. Yeah, sounds really good. And yeah, so if anyone also has further questions or reflections, I invite you to share those. And I would really love it too if people were kind of would share what their next action steps might be. Maybe if you got anything out of this webinar and that you want to kind of take moving forward in your actions. It says, I can't read the link to the planning tools, it's in yellow. I think Sarah might be mentioning this, but we'll be sending them out so you can have access to those in an email after the webinar. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Let's stop sharing.
Okay.
Just give it a few minutes. Do you guys have any comments or anything like that to make? Yeah, like Ren said, I think it'd be great to hear about some steps you're going to take or have taken already. Susan said she bought a bee house. And yeah, Ren, do you know if it takes a long time for the bees to find the bee house?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what kind of bee house that you got. So if it's one for mason bees, they come out in the spring, so they like April and May, and that's when they'll do their nesting activity. So I think it would depend on what type of bee. So she says, I bought this house last year, huge front yard, took about 1/4 of it and made a nice pollinator, hummingbird, bee, butterfly garden. Nice. Elas yard grass. Yes, good to hear. This year I have planted some fruit trees and berry bushes too. Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Oh, Judy's getting her grandkids involved. Yes, that's so great. I feel like it's most important, just to get kids involved at a young age, kind of really build that consciousness around it. Is ideal. And also, so in people that, I don't know if anyone here is living in an apartment or doesn't have that access to land, I think just want to kind of reiterate the community garden aspect. And I think you could still get a bee box and do some container gardening on it if you had a balcony, or maybe even if there was a little space, depending on what the complex is, like there's a little space around the complex where people could come together and start a garden for the apartment complex. That's a potential idea. Let's see. Yeah, the process of creating new garden beds. Yeah, we'll get the link to the slides. That'll come in an email. But that's really exciting about the garden beds. Yeah, I wish you the best of luck with that. It's a great way to get pollinator plantings going.
Yeah, so for the slides, the recording will be posted on YouTube, and the link to the YouTube channel will be in the email. If you want the slides just by themselves, you can email me personally, and I can send this to you if you'd rather have it that way. My personal email will be listed in that follow-up email. So if there's anything else you might need, you can also ask for it.
And let's see, there are these additional questions. We're on the 7th floor, planted native plants, but never saw pollinators. Mm-hmm. My question would be, was it planted on a balcony, like container garden situation? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I might, yeah, that's tricky. I might consider increasing your plantings, or also trying the bee box, or also including the water. Those might just be things to experiment with. Sometimes if you're maybe more isolated too from more natural spaces, it can be difficult because the habitat is so fragmented. So that could be a potential barrier. But hopefully that helps. Maybe just to try some of those additional steps so that it's not So it just offers a bit more to entice them in. And yeah, okay. Let's see. I bought the same kind of bee house that was in the slide, so is the nesting period over? I think the nesting period is coming to an end for the mason bees in particular. I think I read about the leafcutter bees that are in the summer that they like a little bit of the bigger tubes. I don't actually have the one that is in the slide. I have one that is specific to mason bees that was donated to the school, and so I'm not 100% sure about which. I think there was a variety of sizes in that one. But do mason bees like herbs like thyme, rosemary, etc.? I have 2 honeybee hives, but they're cared for differently than mason bees. I'm not sure about the specifics of those. I think I'm not sure about the specifics of those because it's not 100% my area of expertise, but maybe a Google search might help with that. Yeah, sorry about that. Honeybee hives. Okay.
So it looks like we're getting close on time. Thank you guys so much for joining in. And again, I will be sending out a follow-up email. So if there's any further questions, you can also email me those questions. We'll be happy to try our best at answering them or assist you in any way. Also, please check out our website, which is amifellows.org, for future workshops, events, and also donations. Our workshops are free and open to the public. So this makes it happen. So donations are definitely welcome. And we really hope to see you at future workshops. And thank you so much.